Hello and shalom. Welcome to this episode of Image Bearers Radio. I'm your host, Joe Amon. We got a great show ahead, so buckle up and hang on. Here we go. Hey, shalom, shalom, and everybody. Welcome to episode 152 of Image Bearers Radio. I'm your host, Joe Amon, coming to you all the way from Out of Ashes Ministries in DeRidder, Louisiana, and I hope you are having a fantastic week. I know it's the middle of summer, and it's hot as blue blazes, but man, we are blessed and we are favored, and I hope that things are going well for you. And even if they're not going the best that you would actually hope for, I hope that the Father is teaching you some things during this time, during this season. We're in a cool season right now. I'll talk about that in a little bit later. But first of all, let me just welcome everybody. If it's your first time here, thank you guys so much for being a part of IBR. Maybe you're listening to this watching on YouTube. Maybe you're listening on your favorite podcast app or through our website, wherever you may be listening, Hebrew Nation Online, possibly in the archive or live during the week, whatever it is. Thank you guys for listening, for checking out Image Bearers Radio. I hope that you enjoy the episode and enjoy the content. And if you do, please come back again, share, and all the things, subscribe, and do all the things you're supposed to do, all the doodly doos that you're supposed to do on social media and all that kind of stuff. And if you are looking for fellowship, or if you have fellowship that meets at a different time and you'd like to join with Out of Ashes Ministries here in Southwest Louisiana, if you're local to the area or you're within driving distance, man, come out and hang out with us on Shabbat. We meet every Shabbat at 10 a.m. Central, and you can come and hang out. Feel free to be our guest. We eat together at Oneg afterwards. We have a wonderful service with worship and the Parsha reading, teaching, and fellowship. It's awesome. So we invite you to come and hang out and feel like family. And if you're not local and would still like to just check out what's going on here at OAM and join us for a Shabbat, you can do that. Again, 10 a.m. Central Time. You can go to our website at outofashesministries.org/live, and you can pick up our live stream there. We also multi-stream each and every week to Facebook and to YouTube. So if one of those platforms fits your needs and desires better, then please join us and hang out and spend some time with us. We would love to have you. For those of you guys that are longtime listeners and followers and part of OAM and Image Bearers Radio, I just want to say thank you to you guys for being an awesome community. Thank you for your support, as always, for sharing these episodes, for commenting and creating conversation around them. It's so very, very important and so much fun. And so lastly, I just ask what I've been doing the last several weeks. If you would like to support what we're doing here at Image Bearers Radio, some of you give and donate and support the podcast separately from the ministry. I just think that's super cool. If you would like to do that, you can go to our website again at outofashesministries.org/give, and you can give one time, you can give a small donation, you can give a super big donation, it'd be great, or you can give recurring if you'd like, $5 a month or a week or whatever, would be great. Anything that you give really helps to improve the quality and make sure that we can keep bringing you these episodes. So, with all of the niceties and the hellos and the how are yous out of the way, let's get into this week's episode 152, where we are continuing our conversation on the history of the Sanhedrin, the Great Sanhedrin, and let's go to the Father in a moment of prayer, as is our custom. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and King, we bless you and thank you for this time together. We thank you, Father, for the ability to be able to learn and grow and ask questions and let our curiosity run wild. We thank you that it doesn't make you nervous or afraid, but you embrace our seeking of you. So as we do that today, please bless us through Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen and amen. All right, everybody. So this is episode 152. We are still talking about the Great Sanhedrin HaGedolah. And I know this has been, maybe it may seem kind of like an arduous, long-term kind of thing, but I think it's important to take some time talking about Sanhedrin. Because, as we've said in weeks past, it's an institution that most of us from a Christian background, we hear about it in the Gospels, and it's not usually in a positive light, and so we don't really have a good understanding of what Sanhedrin is, where it comes from, what its purposes are, how it functions, how it changes over the years, how it affects the lives of Jews living in the Second Temple period when Yeshua comes on the scene. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of things that we need to correct that I think will become very, very helpful for our understanding the world and culture of Yeshua if we'll just kind of lean into it a little bit. And so if you have found, some of this information and this part of the series to be kind of like a slog, I want to ask you, we're going to do probably 2 more weeks on Sanhedrin. And so I want to ask you to just kind of lean into it a little bit and let it become a part of the world of Yeshua, because that's really what we're talking about. Just to kind of, put in perspective what we're talking about when we talk about Sanhedrin. They are, for intents and purposes, the supreme court of their day. But in the land of Judea, in Israel, especially in the Second Temple period, you don't really have a separation of church and state like we know of it in America. In the golden age of Israel's history, they are theocracy, right? Which means that the king and the Sanhedrin have to rule in accordance with each other. And basically the Sanhedrin kind of gets to check and balance, not kind of, they get to check and balance the king. The great Sanhedrin Gadolah, when they're seated in the temple, they're the only ones that can actually try the king. And so there is a check and balance there to make sure that the king is following the Torah and they're leading, together. And so there's not a separation like we would think of it today, but they are the supreme court of the land of Israel. Now, when we get into Second Temple period after the Babylonian exile, they are still the final say in laws of Jewish, halakha. However, you have Rome that is the empire over them, so they don't have their own king. They're being ruled by a foreign government, right? First the Persians, then the Greeks, and now the Romans. And so the way that the court operates has to shift and change a little bit. And I always like to try to bring this forward to our modern day context to try to make it make sense. Now, what we can't do is we can't try to understand in our context and say, oh, that's how it was for them. This is for us to understand, okay? So we can't put our modern understanding back on an ancient culture and say, well, this is how they thought about it. Maybe not. This is to help us think about it in our day and age. So I've said a couple of, different times, various times, I think I probably said it last week maybe, this is the functioning of the Sanhedrin should be really easy for us to understand and really difficult at the same time, because in the ease of understanding, we have a court system. We have a set of laws that we are governed by as a nation that we all agree to as Americans. Well, maybe not all, but that we agree to as Americans. And that's what makes us a citizen, right? I mean, it makes us a legal citizen. Now, if we have an issue, if we have a disagreement between people, if we break a law and we have a disagreement between us and government, the accountability that is backing those laws, then we appeal to the court, which is a system of justice that is supposed to be fair and unbiased, a system of our peers, right? And those that are educated in this law. So the first thing I want to remind you is that just like you and I are not educated in every detail of American law, civil law, traffic laws, finance law, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm out of my, way out over my skis a little bit, but we are not educated in every tiny minutia of law that governs us in America. But we don't have to be. We have to be educated in the things that we interact with daily. So traffic laws, right? If you're going through the death of a parent, Then you have to deal with estate laws and things like that, right? If you've ever gone through a divorce, you have to know about divorce law. You have to have some kind of understanding about how it works. But we go to experts in those fields for those things because it's not stuff that we run up against every day. In the same way, you can think about the ancient Jew or the ancient Israelite that would probably not have been educated in all aspects and all the minutia of the law. Remember that for the vast majority of Israelite history, they only heard the Torah read once every 7 years. And then the Levites and the priests, when they were off duty from their service in the temple, they would spread out throughout the country in the towns where they lived, and they would teach. But the Torah was only read, in community until after the return from the Babylonian exile, when the things of synagogues, the institution of synagogues began to be a thing. And then you have more of an every day and every week and every Shabbat learning, right, as we're told in the New Testament. So you have you have people that are probably not experts. I mean, they're dumb, and I'm not trying to take away from them. What I mean is that they're like us. We have some very educated people. We have neuroscientists and finance people and farmers and agricultural people and that are brilliant people. But it doesn't mean that they're lawyers. They haven't invested their interest and their knowledge in the law. And so there's just areas that they may not be aware of. It may be, they leave that to experts, people who go to school and who have vast libraries of books. And in the same way, this is in every culture. And so it would not be much different for the Israelite world. Now, they do have a standing temple, etc. So it gives them some insights that we do not have. However, I still think the idea would apply. And so they would know laws that they had to interact with every day. Temple laws, maybe. If you lived in and around Jerusalem, you would probably be more familiar with temple laws, purity laws, etc., liturgy, etc., stuff like that. If you lived in the north or in the Negev in the south, and in the Galilee or the Golan up in the north or in the Negev in the south, you may only make it to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the Shlosh Regalim, the pilgrimage festivals. You may not even be really familiar with temple protocol, as big of a deal as the temple is in and around Jerusalem. So there's all these dynamics to understand, right? And when we talk about things like the oral Torah, the Mishnah and Talmud, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the code of law, of halakhic practice, and how a Jewish person, man and woman and child, does what God commanded them and preserves the covenant. And, I think about this a lot. We tend to think like, like the Jewish people preserved the Torah. God enabled them to preserve the Torah. And somehow in our narcissistic, self-centered universe, we think like, they did that for us. God's plan was so that the Jewish people could preserve the Torah so that one day we could have it. And the thing you got to remind yourself is that while changes are taking place, the Sanhedrin is evolving, Jewish culture is evolving throughout the captivities and exile and return and all these different things, they're not thinking about us. They don't have us in mind whatsoever. What they have is a remembering of the former years, the patriarchs, the covenant, the things that they were entrusted, the deliverance from Egypt, and they have an expectation and a hope and a desire to see their children be safe and their nation, their way of life, their culture be preserved for the next generation. They don't have an idea that the non-Jewish world would ever take hold of and make their Torah theirs. I hope that makes sense. Because we have a really big tendency to think like, the Torah is in the Bible and the Bible is ours as Christians. Therefore, like if A equals C and B equals C, then, or however that works, I'm not a math person, but we tend to think like, since the Bible is ours as Christians, it's our Bible that God gave to us, and the Torah is just a part of that Bible, then that must mean that the Torah is ultimately, was preserved for us. And the truth of the matter is that the Torah belongs to the Jewish people. God gave it to them. And we can get into debates about the mixed multitude, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to get into that debate right here. But the idea is that in the Jewish mind, throughout the centuries, there may have been some parts, some sects of Judaism that would imagine the prophecy about the exiles being ingathered, the ingathering, right? But even that is graded in that, well, maybe the ingathering of the exiles are the Jewish exiles, are the Israelite exiles. I don't know how much the Jewish world at large throughout the centuries would have imagined the non-Jewish world, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, whoever, being a part of the Torah keeping tradition. And so I think that's something that's really important to think about and to really wrap our heads around, because again, in a really self-centered, narcissistic way, we have an idea that floats around in some of our circles and some of our minds that, well, like some of the decisions they made, we wouldn't have made those same decisions, or we wish they would have made different decisions. We wish it would have been done a different way. And the truth of the matter is, like, well, it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what I think. We are not a part of their consideration, and we shouldn't have been. It's no way possible for us to have been, because that's not the purpose of the decision making of the courts and the judges, and then the culture, the following of the people all together. I hope that makes sense. That's kind of rambly, but again, it's just something I think about a lot, and I think about, it's important to think about how we think about things. And I think, again, I'll say think like 17 more times. That's something really important for us to think about. All right. So we left off at the end of our last episode, which is 2 weeks ago, because we had bad weather last week and I couldn't record. We left off talking about the calendar. So I want to back up a little bit and kind of ramp up to that, talk about the calendar a little bit more, and then we're going to move on into more of a functioning, how the Sanhedrin functioned. And so we have some emperors, some Roman emperors that are in the 2nd and 3rd century AD. And some are very friendly to the Jewish people and to Jerusalem. Some are not so much. And so it's important, because the Sanhedrin, when it is kind of at its height and it is the ruling, governing body of Israel, after the destruction of the temple, that all starts to go away. Because remember, we said that the Sanhedrin has its authority when it's seated in the hall of hewn stone in the temple in Beit HaMikdash. That's where it has its ultimate authority. And we looked last episode at where the hall of hewn stone, the Lishkat Hagazit, is attached to the Azarah, the center temple court. And then after the destruction of the temple, of course, they get driven from there. And we talked about how they moved to Yavne and different places back and forth, ended up in Tiberias, where they were officially disbanded, where they disbanded the Sanhedrin. But they moved around from place to place. And all those decades that passed by, their authority became diminished. And so we have this emperor that shows up named Julian. And he was really a proponent of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, and wanted to restore it to its previous prowess, to its previous magnificence. And then we find out that there was sabotage, is what we think, that there were fires in the foundations and stuff, and it just never happened. It was blamed on like earthquakes and things like that, but he eventually gave up. Because he couldn't get anyone to work it because of all the trouble that they had. And so the failure to Julian's attempt to rebuild, that failure has been ascribed to an earthquake in the year 363, but also to sabotage, where the Jewish people were like, no Roman pagan emperor is going to rebuild our temple. That's for us to do. And so who knows? Divine intervention was the most common thought or explanation. And but the Jewish people did appreciate his support. He just didn't want him building the temple, because that's not the way it's supposed to work. He was a refreshment after the hostility from previous emperors. And I think in the coming years, the Jewish people would have wished for a Julian back again, because after him takes over this emperor named Theodosius. And Theodosius the first, he forbid the Sanhedrin to meet, to assemble at all, and he declared ordination illegal. So they could not ordain new rabbis. They could not pass on smicha, or authority, to new rabbis for teachers and stuff. And he prescribed capital punishment for any ordination that was done. So what would happen is that if the Sanhedrin met, by this time they were called Beit HaMidrash, if Beit HaMidrash met in a community to ordain a rabbi, and the Romans found out about it, they would destroy the entire village. And some reports say that maybe they would even kill the rabbi and his family. And they would destroy the entire town or village where the ordination occurred. And so Theodosius was a real tyrant towards the Jewish people, especially in with his focus on the Sanhedrin. He was trying to rip away that last governing authority, because what any conquering nation wants to do. The Assyrians were really big on this, is that they wanted to water down the nation that they conquered. They wanted to water down their patriotism and their sense of nationalism and their sense of identity, and they wanted to water that down and to deconcentrate that, so that way they could re-identify them as their now conquered people and citizens of their kingdom. And so Assyria was really bad about that. Babylon was actually not so bad about that. Persia was not so bad about that, depending on the emperor or the leader. And then Rome, again, depending on the leader, was either good or bad about that. Some wanted the Jewish people to be their own Jewish selves, and others wanted to make them Roman. And so this Theodosius guy did a real number, and he was very violent towards the Jewish people. And this is where we have, in this context, that we have the calendar decision that everybody in the Hebrew roots, Messianic world loses their mind over, and people fight over. And it's just the subject of such vilification. It's the subject of such just nasty debate and hard feeling and misunderstanding. And it's just terrible. And I think a lot of it comes just from a big ignorance of history and a refusal to think about the issues surrounding the decision on the calendar. So everybody knows. If you don't know, I'm going to just give you a little bit of education. Most folks know that the way that the ancient calendar was kept when the temple was standing is that there's either 29 or 30 days in a month. And they were sky watchers, of course. Everybody was, because they didn't look down at their phones and tablets. They looked up at the sky. And so they would watch the moon, and the moon would wax, and then it would start to wane. And they knew that there was about 15 sunsets and sunrises before the next moon. So they would be watching for the first sliver of the new moon. And as they would begin to see that, witnesses would come up to Jerusalem, up to the temple, and they would declare, "We have seen the sliver of the new moon." They would be taken by the priest into a chamber, and they would be shown a series of pictures depicting different phases of the moon. And we would say, "Tell me what you saw." And they would have to testify what they saw. That was not the declaration of the new moon. A second witness must come and must be separated from that first witness and must give an independent account. And when the two counts matched, it's still not Rosh Chodesh. It's still not the new month. Then the Sanhedrin would have to meet and give credibility, verify the account, and then they would declare, based on the witness testimony, the new moon, and they would light the signal fires and sound the shofar. That was Rosh Chodesh. That was the new month. And so this process, everybody knows this process. The Jewish people today know this process. The Sanhedrin, when they made this ruling, they knew the process. Yet, since the calendar is based on eyewitness testimony, it became very dangerous for witnesses, first of all, for a Sanhedrin to meet, to hear the testimony, and for witnesses to come. The whole thing is a setup for destruction, right? You can't do this. And so we were going to take a break, and we're going to come back in the next segment, and I really want to, we may spend the rest of the episode on this. I really want to get you to think about this, because it's so important to help understand where we are today and why we have some of these debates and why maybe things are done the way they are, it is crucial to understand why this decision was made and try to relate to it a little bit. So don't go away. We'll be right back right after the break. We'll see you then. All right, guys, welcome back. So again, I don't want to beat this calendar thing, to death, but I just, and maybe you have too, maybe you haven't. Hopefully, you haven't been exposed to this, but I have just seen so much damage done over this calendar debate, and there's some really hard truths about this calendar debate. There's some really hard truths in that we have an ignorance as to why it was done. There's just some understanding that, well, they just changed it. The rabbis just changed it. Again, this amorphous group of rabbis that we don't know. We don't know any of their names. We don't know any of their history. We don't know their family. We don't know anything about them. We just blame them for everything that we don't like. Again, it's not about us. It's not about you. It's not about me. Nobody cares. And it doesn't affect you. It's not your calendar. It's not your decision. It's not your families that would have been put at risk going to meet in secret to testify of the new moon. And I know there's going to be people out there that listen to this that say, oh, well, but if it was me, though, we stand for righteousness and we stand for the thing that God said, and we're like the spies and we would have gone and witnessed and all of that. No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't. Sorry. Because most of us are cowards. And I know that's really strong language, but you don't realize how much you compromise every day. And I don't realize how much I'm not saying this to you. I'm saying this to us as a people. I'm trying to get us to come together in some understanding. We don't realize how much we compromise on biblical truths every single day. We compromise, we justify our compromising. We are masters at existing and making it through to another day. And that's exactly what it takes in order to survive. Are you saying it takes compromise to survive? Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes, yeah. You can think you're a Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego. And you may be. You may be. I pray to God, the Father in heaven, that is never tested. I pray that you're never tested in that aspect. I pray that you are never asked to be as courageous as you think you are, as you put other people down for not being. I pray you're never tested to that amount of courage. So, since the calendar was based on eyewitness testimony, it became far too dangerous. Beside the fact, so Hillel II recommended a calculated calendar, a mathematically based calendar, because he understood that the system, the skies, the Mazarot, runs on it's a system. It's very consistent. And so he developed this mathematically based calculated calendar we talk about. They got together one last time at a hidden meeting in the year 358, and this was the last official decision of what we know of as the Sanhedrin. And they said, we're going to adopt this calendar. This is going to be the calendar that we use in order to preserve the commandments as we were instructed to do at Sinai, in order to stay the people of the covenant, in order to preserve the festivals, in order to preserve Shabbat, in order to preserve the timekeeping from an Elohist or from an Elohim, a Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh perspective. This is how we're going to do that. And so for them, the method of keeping time, i.e., sighting the new moon and declaring it, had to come second to the overall responsibility and requirement of, this is my covenant with you. You are not to forsake it, right? And so I think that gets lost in the conversation sometimes, because the truth is you can't break a commandment in order to keep a commandment, right? And as we study the Torah, we study things like Sefer HaMitzvot from Rambam. We study things like Sefer HaChinuch. There's a very plain understanding that you have positive commandments and negative commandments. And it doesn't mean that some are good and some are bad. It means the positives are you shall do. They're proactive. And the negatives are you shall not do. They tend to be seen as more passive. They're just things that you don't engage in. However, those you shall do are things that you have to put effort into, right? And the thing that has been worked out in Judaism throughout the centuries is that a positive commandment takes precedent over a negative commandment. And so you have the ultimate Torah ethic, the ultimate Torah value is the salvation of life, the preserving of life, the saving of life. And so as a ruling body, as a group that everyone's looking to in order to figure out what we're doing, it's up to them to decide, are we going to put people's lives at risk? We're going to put our own lives at risk, or are we going to figure out a way to make this work, to still continue to preserve the commandments and the appointed times into the future, into diaspora for our children. Again, they're not thinking of the church so that one day the church can keep the calendar, so that one day the whole world will have the Torah. No, so that our children, the next children after them, our children's children, as the Torah says, can be a part of and can be in covenant with the Creator of the heavens and the earth. And so I don't think we give enough respect to the gravity of this situation. We don't give enough respect to the gravity of the situation. Here's the thing, is that a lot of people that argue over the calendar they're armchair quarterbacks. The truth is that a lot of people that argue over this, they don't have authority over anyone. They're not accountable to anyone. Nobody looks to them for direction. They're not a part of a group that steers an institution or a congregation or a large group. They will fight and fight and fight and fight and fight to tell you why the Jews are wrong for keeping this calculated calendar, and they don't have any skin in the game. They can just offer pot shots, they can criticize, they can be nasty, they can call the Jewish people ignorant or malicious or words worse than that. They can do all of that because they don't know the pressure. They don't know the responsibility of what it means to set direction and accountability for a group of people that their lives are based on, that their lives are dependent upon. And so I don't think this decision gets enough respect. The learning about the history about it. You know what? Don't read about the Jewish part of it. Read about the Roman part of it. Read about what the Romans said about the Jews and how Theodosius the First, and then we're going to read about Theodosius the Second, about how they treated the Jews. Read some history and understand the gravity of this decision that had to be made and why it was made. It's incredibly important. Now listen, I'll say this, like I've said this through all of this series. I'll continue to say it as we continue to move through this series even further down the road. It doesn't make a hill of beans to me what calendar you keep. Keep the solstice, equa, zada, whatever. I don't even care. I don't even know anymore. There's so many things that have come up. I just quit keeping count. I used to study the calendars. I was really up on what was what. I don't even care anymore. It doesn't matter. I know what I believe. I do what I do. It's cool. I don't have any problem with anybody else. Do whatever you want, okay? If you want to keep Passover when Sukkot should be and keep Sukkot and Passover should be, do it. Who cares? Nobody cares, okay? You do you. You go with God and just, I know everything will work out fine, okay? But don't be a jerk about it. And you say, well, that's awfully funny coming from you. You're being very jerky. I'm not trying to be a jerk at this point. I'm trying to get some people to understand that there is more context maybe to this than what you realize. And that there is a real life back here. I know, I get the Zadokite thing. Yes, I know. The Enochian calendar, yep, probably valid at some point in some way. However, when it came down to keeping the people of Israel together as much as possible, the decision was made to do a calculated calendar. Period. And remember, we talked about what makes us U.S. citizens and what makes our country work is that we as a citizenry, not in every detail, but overall, we agree that we will be under the government's care and they will be under our accountability. We agree. We give them the authority. That's how this thing works. That's how government, it's how nations works, how society works. Now, I know there are some of you out there that are, anti-establishment, fundamentalists and all that. And I get that. And I'm more libertarian probably than anything else. So I understand that in some aspects. But the truth is that for society to function, there has to be some sort of structure. I wish it was that every man could govern himself appropriately. But go to Walmart. You see people acting out of sorts, acting like they shouldn't. You see their kids acting crazy. Go to the fair when it comes once a year. Go to a festival. Go to church. And people don't act like you think they should act. People are not living like you think they should live. So the truth of the matter is that God set up structures. God set up authorities. And we have to just wrestle with that. We have to just wrestle with it, and we have to come to terms with being okay and not be the sky is falling, everybody's out to get us, everything is a conspiracy kind of people. There are conspiracies. Yes, there are bad things going on. There are people that are pulling levers in the background. Yes, I get it all. There's dark stuff everywhere. But as a person of the Torah, as a person of the kingdom, as a follower of Yeshua, our job is to promote the light and the good and to, by our living those things, to push back on all the other junk. The dark stuff can't be there when light is shown. And that doesn't mean you have to bring a pitchfork and torches to your local town hall and demand things should be done your way. It's not what I mean. I mean, you live according to righteousness. Leave the other nonsense in your own head or with your own friends or your own family. But you live in righteousness and in light. And that's what gets rid of darkness. All right. The last decision, universal decision made by this body was the adoption of the calendar. And thank God they did it. Thank God they did it. Now, what we also know from history is that all along, there have been groups of Jews, families, individuals, groups that have kept both a moon sighting and a calculated. They do both. One of the things that Yoel Halevi, he has a teaching page and organization called Hebrew in Israel. One of the things that he has talked to me about, I thought just was fascinating. He has been one of the leaders in the Aviv search for the last 15 years. He has been one of the people who has led that study and trying to preserve that understanding of how that was done and what is Aviv and what does it mean and looking at barley fields and all that. He's been one of the forerunners in that. And he says, the way I see it, the Aviv is now, but the calendar is this, and so this is what we're going to do. And it's still hard for me to understand, but if you know that this is the Aviv and this is when the month should be, then why do you still do the calendar? But for him, there's no warring there. There's no dispute there. It's that this is what we do. We do the calendar the way that our ancestors decided to do it. This is what keeps us together as a people. And so these things are not opposing each other. This is our ancient tradition, though, and we're preserving it because one day we're going to come back to it. And so it's a beautiful harmony in the Jewish world. It's not opposed. And see, that's part of our problem is that because of our Westernism, because of our Americanism, because of our Greek, whatever it is in us, we can't hold two opposing views together at the same time. It has to be one or the other. One is truth and one is not. Well, no, the truth is that they're both truth and they can be held together in tension. And we have to be better at doing that if we're going to be serious Bible students, because the Bible often holds two opposing views in tension. And so we need to be better at cultivating that skill. And so no matter what you think about the calendar, this is some history that I hope you find, and some thought, some philosophy maybe, that I hope you find challenging. And again, it doesn't matter what calendar you end up keeping. I'm not trying to evangelize you into keeping the Hillel calendar. It doesn't matter. But at least want you to understand the weight of the decision that had to be made and why it had to be made that way. And at least respect the idea that it is. Now, should it be different now? Maybe it should. But the Sanhedrin was disbanded after this, right? In 358. And so next, in the 400s to 425 or so, you have Gamaliel VI, which is the Sanhedrin's last president. They are still meeting in some senses, but they're not making any decisions. And then with his death in 425, Theodosius II outlawed the title of Nasi, which is the president of the Sanhedrin, and the last remains of the Sanhedrin were finally gone. We find out later, now in 2004, so 20 years ago, experts in Israel were excavating in Tiberias, and they found a structure dating back to the 3rd century that they believe was the seat of the Sanhedrin when it was in that city all those years ago. And so the Sanhedrin, just to kind of wrap up this part, is traditionally viewed, and when I say traditionally viewed, this is how the Jewish world sees the Sanhedrin. They are the last institution that commanded universal authority among the Jewish people. In the chain of tradition from Moses, the chain of Mosaic authority, right? We talked a lot about that. From the time of Moses until present day, they are seen as Moses. Not because they said so or because they called themselves that, because that's the way they understand the scripture, okay? Since its dissolution in 358 by imperial Roman decree, there have been some attempts to reestablish. We hear about that often. Oh, there's a Sanhedrin, right? To establish it either as a self-governing body or kind of as a puppet of the government that's in place. But there has been no universally recognized authority within Jewish law. And that's the important thing. So I was talking about a while ago. There have been attempts. Certain groups have tried to put together a new Sanhedrin. And when you ask, ask like a Hanok, or ask a Yoel, or ask a, Daron Kidar, who does a lot of stuff here in the States, or, any of the Jewish, any of Israelis that come and speak that you might have access to, or a Moshe Kempinski at the Shorashim shop, who's really active on social media, or if you know a rabbi, anybody, ask them, why isn't there a Sanhedrin today? And probably one of the answers you're going to get, maybe the most popular answer you're going to get, is because there's not a universal acceptance in a certain group, a certain makeup, right? And that goes back to what I was saying earlier. That's what it takes in order to form this structure, this authority structure, is that there has to be universal, or mostly, or majority at least, agreement, okay, that we will listen to the decisions of this court. Again, the majority of Americans, you might say, not me, then I'm not talking about you. The majority of American society has said, whatever it is, we will accept the decisions of the Supreme Court, right? We'll just accept it. That's what we have decided. Sometimes we love their decisions. Sometimes we hate their decisions. But we will trust that they are doing their due diligence, that they are smart people that have the America and the country at their best interest, and we will agree to accept their decisions. That has not happened with a Sanhedrin in the land of Israel. Thus, there is no officially recognized Sanhedrin. And so we have this group in October of 2004, a group of rabbis from various Orthodox traditions and communities in Israel. They actually did a ceremony in Tiberias, which is kind of the last place of the last Sanhedrin in the 400s, where it was disbanded, and they claimed to reestablish the Sanhedrin, the body of the Sanhedrin, according to the proposal of Maimonides, the Rambam, and the Jewish legal rulings and all these things. And it has been a real debate within Jewish circles because, again, there's been no codification. There's been no like everybody going like, okay, yep, that's the group. We're gonna follow them, okay, and make it official. And this is their role, and this is the authority that they have. And there's not been any of that. So to kind of wrap up this week's episode, I want to start to get into kind of the religious aspects of the Sanhedrin, because I think that's one of the things that we're really concerned about, and that gets missed in a lot of discussions. So, it met, of course, like we said, in the Hall of Hewn Stone, right? Which was it was also called the Great Beit Din, the Great Beit Din, Beit Din Hagadolah, or simply the Beit Din in the Hall of Hewn Stones, Lishkat Hagazit, which we showed you last week. And it was invested the highest religious authority. Now remember, when we say it was invested the highest religious authority, well, who gave them that authority? Well, two different entities. God did, and the people did, right? And so God said, this is how you're supposed to pass on. These are the people that are supposed to make the judgments, and don't turn away from the left or to the right. Don't act presumptuously. That's in Deuteronomy and Numbers. And the people said, okay, we will agree, right? So you have both sides of the deal. According to Talmudic tradition, it originated in the Mosaic period with the 70 elders. We've talked about that, who are associated with Moshe in the government of Israel at his request. That's in Numbers 11. Forming together with him the first Sanhedrin. The institution is said to have existed without interruption from that time, the time of Moses, onward. And it is said that Nebuzaradan brought the great Sanhedrin to Riblah before Nebuchadnezzar. But the fact that no passage in the pre-exilic books in the Bible refers to this institution seems to indicate it was not introduced before the time of the Second Temple. So what that statement is saying is that there's no mention of the Great Sanhedrin, so we don't know that it existed, which is an argument that is used a lot by anti-rabbinics, anti-Semites. And we talked about this, that there is no name for Sanhedrin. The institution itself is not necessarily mentioned except for the men of the Great Assembly after the exile. And so there is some pushback about like, well, it didn't exist because it's never mentioned. If that is that important, then why isn't it mentioned? According to Rabbi Yosei ben Halafta, the members of the Great Din were required to possess the following qualifications. So these are the people that make up the Great Sanhedrin. We've talked about its history, we've talked about its formation, its ascension, and its decline, and all those things. Talk about the people that made it up. They were to be people of scholarship. So these are smart people. I think that's another thing I want to kind of, disembody, is this notion that these are dummies, or they just didn't know the law. Well, they didn't know the Torah. It's how did they not know? How could they make this calendar decision? Didn't they know? How could they make this kind of decision? Didn't they know? These guys are the top of the top of the top of the top of religious scholarship of their time. They were to be people of scholarship. They were to be people of modesty. And they were to be popular among their fellow men. According to an interpretation in Numbers, there's a writing called Sifrei, Numbers 92, it's a commentary, they also had to be strong and courageous. Only such were eligible as had filled 3 offices of gradually increasing dignity, namely those of a local judge, a member of successively 2 magistrates at Jerusalem. And so what you have is you have someone who has been a successful and fair and good local judge in a group of 3 judges that sit in a small town. And then if he is, then he is He is asked to come up to Jerusalem and serve on smaller courts in Jerusalem. This is much the same way that you watch a Supreme Court hearing, and this is the way that it's done, right? They must be tall, of imposing appearance, advanced of age, and learned, and must understand foreign languages as well. And this is something I want to leave off on today as kind of a cliffhanger. And they must understand the arts of the necromancer. That's a cliffhanger for next week. We'll talk about why that is. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I hope that you have a great rest of the week. Tune in again next week for episode 153. Until then, shalom, shalom.